Most women are taught from the earliest age that love is earned through understanding, that value must be defended, that to be chosen, to be worthy, she must explain herself, her emotions, her silence, her desires, her tears. The world conditions her to believe that clarity is currency, that the more she translates her soul for others, the more lovable she becomes. But what would you think if I told you that the opposite is true? That the moment a woman stops explaining herself, she becomes magnetic. Not because she's withholding, but because she's returned to her essence, because what is sacred no longer justifies its existence to the ordinary. Carl Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, but the path to becoming is not paved with explanations. It is carved through silence, solitude, and sovereignty. And it is through that silence, not submission, that a woman becomes irresistible to a man's unconscious. Not the surface man, the polite man, the one trained in social contract, but the deeper male psyche, the primal mythic hunter who senses the scent of mystery and cannot look away. When a woman ceases to justify her no, her absence, her softness, her anger, her pleasure, she is no longer operating from the wound of being misunderstood. She no longer begs the ego of the other to see her. Instead, she lets her soul speak in its native tongue, intuition, poise, presence, and this drives the unawakened man mad. Because the man who is still ruled by ego will always want a woman he can interpret, explain, manage. His unconscious fear is not in being rejected, but in being revealed. The silent woman becomes a mirror to his chaos. She no longer plays the role of mother, therapist, priestess, or savior. She does not explain her silence to soothe his anxiety. She does not wrap her boundaries in sugar to ease his pride. She does not soften truth into half-lies just to keep his interest. She simply is, and in her beingness, her unshaken presence, she becomes an enigma the ego cannot solve. This is the feminine not as object, but as force, not the feminine who chases love through performance, but the feminine who understands love as vibration, and in this state she becomes the anima, Jung's archetype of the inner feminine. She stirs in the dreams of men, she haunts them, she initiates them, but she will not explain why. To the man who lives on the surface, this is dangerous. He will label her cold, distant, complicated, too much. But to the man who is ready to awaken, who has met his own shadow and survived it, she is everything. Not because she gives herself away, but because she doesn't. Because he cannot possess what is sovereign, and what cannot be possessed becomes sacred. The woman who stops explaining herself is not unkind. She is simply beyond the need for approval. She has transmuted the pain of being misunderstood into the power of self-trust. She does not scream her truth, she embodies it, and embodiment does not beg to be believed. She remembers now that her energy is her voice, that the way she enters a room, the way she chooses silence over performance, is a language more ancient than words. That mystery is not manipulation, it is memory. The memory of her original self before the world carved her into compliance, and so she no longer narrates her worth. She no longer negotiates her instinct. She no longer twists her truth into palatable pieces to fit inside someone else's hunger. She no longer dances for crumbs and calls it connection. She rests, she observes. She knows that a man who is truly capable of intimacy does not require a monologue to respect her. He feels her frequency before she even speaks. He recognizes that her stillness is not emptiness but presence, the very pure essence that evokes transformation. Because in that space where she does not explain, something deeper happens. She becomes a rite of passage. To be in her orbit requires elevation. She is no longer a convenience. She is a threshold, and only those willing to meet her in the fire of real intimacy, beyond masks, beyond roles, beyond control, can cross. And so she lets go. She lets go of being understood. She lets go of pleasing the fragile ego. She lets go of being chosen by those not ready, because now she understands. Her energy is her offering, not her explanation. Her boundaries are not up for debate. Her soul is not a courtroom. And what happens next is inevitable. Men begin to feel her absence like a haunting. They remember her energy long after her words have faded. They replay the moments she did not explain and feel the weight of their own unreadiness. Not because she punished them, but because she didn't need to. She simply stopped performing, and in doing so, she became unforgettable. There is a particular kind of silence that doesn't scream for attention, yet commands it. It is not passive nor withdrawn. It is not the silence of submission or surrender. It is the silence of self-possession, of a woman who knows that her worth is not on trial, that her presence does not require annotation, that her choices do not demand applause. This silence is what begins to drive the masculine unconscious into obsession, because she no longer meets his emotional immaturity with explanation. She does not handhold his confusion. She does not turn herself inside out trying to be understood by a man who hasn't even begun to understand himself. She knows that when a man has not met his own soul, he cannot possibly meet hers, and she refuses to shrink to fit inside his narrow vision of love. Her detachment is not coldness, it is clarity. To the man still trapped in ego, this clarity feels like abandon me, and like rejection. But it is simply her refusal to be consumed by projection. She has done her shadow work. She has walked through the inner fires of self-betrayal and returned with the knowledge that no external validation can repair a self that does not belong to itself. So she no longer over-explains her boundaries, hoping to be seen as reasonable. She no longer performs her pain in hopes of being taken seriously. She no longer narrates her story to win the sympathy of those who never earned the right to witness it. She holds her truth with the dignity of a queen who knows that not everyone is meant to sit at her table. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the ego's desperate need for control, how it clings to certainty to avoid the chaos of the unconscious. But she no longer fears that chaos. She has become it. She is the storm the ego cannot predict, the silence it cannot decode, the fire it cannot extinguish. And because of this, she becomes the embodiment of the divine feminine, uncontrollable, mysterious, vast. Men do not fall in love with a woman they fully understand. They fall in love with the part of her they cannot name, the part that eludes their logic, disrupts their patterns and haunts their solitude. That's the part that awakens them. That's the part that initiates transformation. But only if they are willing, and if they are not, she does not wait. She no longer fills the space with nervous explanations. She no longer tries to soften her truth with disclaimers. She no longer carries the weight of his unhealed mother wound or tries to translate her needs into digestible pieces for a man emotionally starving himself. She lets him misunderstand her, because being misunderstood by the wrong person is safer than being hollowed out for the sake of temporary belonging. She has learned that self-betrayal always costs more than being misread, that peace is more valuable than performance, that explaining herself to someone who only hears through the filter of ego is not connection, it is spiritual erosion. So she becomes still enough to hear the whispers of her own intuition, still enough to choose peace over pursuit, still enough to let the illusions fall, and with them, every man who needed her to dilute herself in order to stay. She begins to attract differently now, not through strategy, but through essence. The men who once chased her while she explained now fall silent in her absence. The ones who called her too much, too sensitive, too complex, find themselves haunted by the space she left behind, not because she punished them, but because she didn't. And in that void they meet themselves. They are left alone with the sound of their own avoidance, their own fear, their own inability to truly see. And if they are brave enough, they will rise. They will learn to listen without demand, to witness without control, to approach without conquest. And maybe then they will be worthy of her reappearance. But she won't be waiting. Because the woman who stops explaining herself doesn't live in the past. She lives forward. Her life is a sacred space, and she has become the gatekeeper of her own soul. She no longer lets the wounded boy in the man dictate the rhythm of her heart. She no longer accepts love offered in confusion, fear, or control. She has rewritten the contract. Now, love must meet her where she is, clear, sovereign, whole. And that is why she becomes irresistible. She walks now with a presence that disturbs illusions. Her energy is clean, not sanitized, but clarified by fire. The fire of every moment she explained herself to be heard, to be softened, to be chosen, and was still dismissed. The fire of every time her wisdom was labeled too intense, her boundaries called too masculine, her silence mistaken for punishment. But now she lets them misunderstand. She lets them project. She lets them label, because a woman who has met her shadow does not seek approval from those who fear their own. Jung taught that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires integrating all that was denied, repressed, or feared. And this is the path she walks now, barefoot and unbending. She is no longer the girl who shapeshifts for safety, no longer the woman who explains herself into invisibility. She does not decorate her boundaries with apologies. She does not give rehearsed speeches when she leaves. She leaves in silence, and that silence echoes. It echoes in the mind of the man who thought she would always stay, in the ego that mistook her softness for weakness, in the psyche of the uninitiated male, still asleep inside the fortress of his control. Her absence is the initiation he didn't ask for but cannot ignore, because she once explained herself out of fear, fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being alone. But now she has embraced solitude as sanctuary. She has discovered that loneliness is not the absence of others, but the absence of self. And once she returned to herself, she realized she was never truly alone, only disconnected from her own power. She is no longer interested in being understood by everyone. She is interested in being deeply known by the few who have the eyes to see, the ears to hear, and the soul to match her own. The rest may interpret her however they need to, and they will. To the insecure, she will seem intimidating. To the immature, aloof. To the manipulative, cold. But none of these perceptions move her now. She knows what she carries, and what she carries is sacred. It's not that she refuses to share her inner world, but that it must now be earned. Access to her soul is no longer given by default. It is not granted to those who ask for explanations out of entitlement. It is reserved for those who approach her with reverence, not demand. Those who understand that true connection does not come from deciphering another's mind, but from honoring their mystery. A man who has done his inner work will feel this immediately. He will not need her to explain her silence. He will feel the weight of it. He will not panic when she pulls back. He will respect the space. He will not demand definitions. He will move with patience and presence, because he knows that the feminine unfolds only in safety, not scrutiny. And he knows that love is not an interrogation, it is an invitation. But most men are not there yet. Most are still grasping, still controlling, still projecting their mother wound onto every woman who refuses to explain herself into submission. These men will call her selfish, detached, emotionally unavailable. But she hears those words now not as accusations, but as revelations. They reveal his lack, not hers. They reveal his readiness, not her coldness. And she lets the words fall to the ground like dead leaves, because the woman who no longer explains herself has become the forest. She no longer seeks paths carved by others. She makes her own. She no longer fears being lost. She is the compass. She no longer speaks to be understood. She speaks to be free. And freedom for her is no longer negotiable. She watches now with the eyes of the ancient feminine, knowing that every time she doesn't explain, every time she holds her ground, every time she refuses to rescue a man from the discomfort of his own mirror, she is reweaving the ancestral wound, the wound that taught women to trade truth for survival, the wound that taught them to overgive, over-explain, over-function. That wound is closed now, not with bitterness but with boundaries. Not with walls, but with wisdom. She becomes a quiet revolution, not because she raises her voice, but because she no longer lowers her soul. And in a world where women are still told that silence is a form of submission, hers becomes a roar that says, I am not here to be decoded. I am not here to be fixed. I am not here to be convenient. I am here to be whole. And so she walks, not ahead to lead nor behind to follow, but beside those who can meet her in truth. Her silence becomes the threshold. It separates those who are willing to meet themselves from those who only wish to control her. Because explaining oneself is often not an act of communication, it's an act of survival, a trained behavior passed down through centuries, where the feminine was forced to convince others that her voice, her intuition, her rage, her boundaries were worthy of existence. But she no longer lives in that lineage of defense. She has stepped out of the ancestral loop and into her own spiral of becoming. She has stopped translating herself into smaller fragments so others feel comfortable. She has stopped shrinking her story into sound bites that avoid triggering fragile egos. She has stopped pouring her wisdom into cups that leak. and in this refusal, she becomes dangerous. Not because she intends harm, but because she refuses to play the roles that allow others to avoid their growth. She is no longer the emotional caretaker, no longer the translator of unconscious wounds, no longer the woman who walks into fire and explains why she's burning. She simply walks out. The men who once basked in her glow now find themselves standing in the cold. They replay her words, the ones she once offered freely, lovingly, pleadingly. They remember the explanations she used to give, the why behind her silence, the reasons behind her leaving, and now they realize how deaf they were, because they never truly listened. They were too busy feeling entitled to answers. But the feminine no longer owes her story to those who weren't present when it was unfolding. She becomes now a guardian of her own mystery, a woman who no longer throws pearls before the unconscious, a woman who has realized that not every question deserves an answer, and not every man is capable of hearing the truth without twisting it into accusation. The man who is still fragmented will always try to pull a whole woman into pieces just to feel safe, but she does not allow that anymore. She has become aligned, psychically, emotionally, spiritually. Her nervous system no longer tolerates chaos disguised as connection. Her soul no longer contracts to fit inside relationships that require her to explain why she needs respect, why her no means no, why her boundaries are not up for debate, why her absence is a decision, not a mistake. She has stopped explaining, and in doing so, she has started living. Now she speaks through embodiment, through alignment, through choices that do not require justification. Her yes is holy and her no is final, and neither comes with a performance attached. She no longer invites others to understand her. They must experience her, in energy, in presence, in how the room shifts when she enters it and does not need to prove anything. This is the woman who moves like water and cannot be grasped, the woman who has faced the loneliness of individuation and emerged as her own sanctuary, the woman who no longer bleeds for love, but breathes it into being through her own fullness. Carl Jung believed that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will rule our lives, and we will call it fate. She knows this now. She sees it playing out all around her. Men and women stuck in karmic loops, repeating wounds in relationships that feel like home because home once meant pain. She refuses to participate. She chooses presence over pattern, consciousness over codependence. She is no longer afraid of being misunderstood because she no longer needs to be validated by misunderstanding minds. And as she stops explaining, something extraordinary happens. She begins to be seen, truly seen, by those who have also done their inner work. Those who do not flinch in the face of silence, who do not recoil from depth, who do not demand access to her softness without having earned it through consistency, clarity, and care. She begins to call in a different kind of man, one who is not threatened by mystery but moved by it, one who does not demand her transparency as proof of trust but offers safety so it can unfold naturally, one who has wrestled with his own shadow and can therefore sit in hers without fear. And this is when her power transcends attraction. She is no longer simply desirable. She becomes transformational. Not because she's trying to change anyone, but because to stand in her presence is to feel the difference between illusion and truth, between egoic love and sacred union, between hunger and devotion. Her power is no longer loud. It is not reactive. It does not beg to be seen. It is, and it speaks in silence louder than 1,000 explanations ever could. She is no longer the woman who trades her soul for connection. There was a time, long ago, or maybe just yesterday, when she thought love meant making herself palatable, when she mistook transparency for safety, when she believed that if she explained herself well enough, thoroughly enough, lovingly enough, she would be accepted, welcomed, chosen. But now she knows the truth. The self that needs explaining will never be safe in hands that can't feel it without words. So she sheds the compulsion, slowly at first, like unlearning a reflex, the way a bird forgets how to return to a broken cage. She still feels the urge rise sometimes, when the silence between texts stretches like a canyon, or when his voice trembles with misunderstanding, or when someone looks at her like a puzzle instead of a person. But she does not betray herself to soothe their confusion, because confusion is part of awakening, and not everyone wants to wake up. She's no longer in the business of waking people. She's in the pay, practice of being awake. And so she walks away from situations that once held her hostage, not with anger, but with grace, not to prove a point, but to protect her peace. She doesn't slam the door anymore. She just closes it gently, without explaining the reasons, without overthinking how they'll interpret her silence, without writing long paragraphs to soothe their guilt, because some doors were never meant to be kept open. Carl Jung knew that the deepest parts of the psyche are not reached through intellect but through experience, through soul, and this woman has become soul-woven. She is no longer trying to be seen by the blind. She is no longer translating her intuition into logic for the comfort of those who live in denial. She lets the silence do the talking, and in that silence, a man is left with only himself. There is no script to follow, no emotional blueprint to decode her, no apologetic reassurance that she didn't mean to hurt him, just space, just the weight of her absence, and the mirror it forces him to face. And if he is conscious, truly conscious, he will feel it. He will feel that the very thing he mistook as distance was actually discernment, that the woman he once called complicated was merely unwilling to be simple for someone who wouldn't deepen, that what he saw as detachment was in fact devotion to herself. This is where obsession is born, not in cruelty, not in games, not in manipulation, but in the aching awareness that she was real and that his ego could not contain her, that she was fire, and he only ever wanted warmth without the burn, but she will not burn for him anymore. She's too sacred for that now, too in tune with her own frequency. She doesn't need to be chased, adored, or praised to feel secure. Her validation comes from alignment, from knowing that her yes is true, her no is whole, and her silence is intentional. You see, when a woman stops explaining herself, she also stops asking for things twice, stops repeating her needs, stops negotiating her intuition. She no longer sees love as something to earn, but as something to discern. And when she discerns that someone cannot meet her there, she doesn't explain why she's leaving. She just leaves, because she knows now energy doesn't lie, even if people do, and her energy is no longer for sale, not to the emotionally unavailable, not to the curious but not serious, not to the ones who ghost and return like it's a game. She has made herself unavailable to the energetically unavailable, and that changes everything. She is not elusive because she wants to be chased. She is elusive because she no longer runs. She no longer performs. She no longer enters conversations with the hope that someone will finally understand her, because she understands herself. That's the thing about feminine power. When it matures, it doesn't speak louder. It speaks less. It doesn't overcompensate, simplifies. It doesn't justify. It withdraws. Not out of punishment, but out of peace. She's not proving anything anymore. She doesn't care if he thinks she's too intense or too quiet, too sensitive or too mysterious, too honest or too hard to read. The woman who knows her worth isn't moved by labels, she's moved by energy. She listens for tone, not just words. She watches actions, not just intent. And when the energy is off, she exits. No grand farewell, no closing monologue, no over-explained boundaries wrapped in empathy, just a quiet, clean break. And somehow, that silence says everything. There is a moment in every awakened woman's life when she realizes her silence holds more power than all the words she's ever spoken. It's not the silence of withholding or manipulation. It's the silence of return. Return to self, return to truth, return to the deep feminine wisdom that was never meant to be debated, only honored. She begins to see that explaining herself was never about clarity. It was about survival, about keeping the peace, about being palatable enough to be loved in a world terrified of complexity. But what the world calls complex is often just unprocessed depth, and now she refuses to make herself digestible for those still starving for their own wholeness. This is the woman who, once upon a time, broke her own heart trying to be understood, who wept in private after shrinking in public, who handed out maps to men who never intended to explore her soul, who explained again and again, not because they asked, but because they didn't care enough to. She no longer does that. She doesn't speak to fill the silence. She doesn't rush to clarify her absence. She doesn't soften her strength with apologetic eyes, because now she knows her clarity is not the absence of emotion, it's the presence of self-worth. And in that presence, everything changes. The way she walks, the way she pauses before answering, the way she no longer offers emotional discounts to those unwilling to pay the price of presence, the way her no lands like thunder, not because it's loud, but because it's absolute. Carl Jung once wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. She knows this now. She sees it play out in the dynamics around her. Men avoiding themselves by avoiding her. Men mislabeling her silence because they fear what it reflects back at them. The ego cannot survive without control, and when she no longer explains, he has none. That is why she becomes unforgettable, because she no longer bends to meet the emotional skill level of those who refuse to grow. She no longer translates her wisdom into digestible, simple, surface-level messages for the emotionally illiterate. She speaks in a frequency that only the heart can hear, and if they can't hear it, she knows they are not meant for her. There is no malice in this discernment, no superiority, only peace, the kind of peace that comes from shedding every layer that was never hers, every story that said she had to convince someone of her goodness, every lie that said femininity was about being agreeable instead of being aligned. She is aligned now. She does not waver because someone misreads her quiet as coldness. She does not collapse when someone demands more than she's willing to give. She does not break when someone leaves in search of something easier. She is not here to be easy. She is here to be real, to be felt in the marrow, to be known, not just seen, to be loved in her fullness, not tolerated in pieces. And this standard does not require announcement. It radiates from her being, from the calm in her voice, from the steady way she says no, from the spaces where she used to explain and now says nothing. Because some things do not require explanation, they require evolution. The man who truly sees her will not need a thesis on her behavior. He will feel it, the way she doesn't chase, the way she doesn't panic, the way she stays rooted while others lose themselves in fear. He will feel the invitation in her presence, not an invitation to possess, but to rise. Because the woman who stops explaining herself does not meet you where you are, she draws you into who you are becoming. And that is terrifying to those still clinging to the safety of the known, but to the one who's ready, to the man who has met the shadow and survived its darkness, she is not intimidating, she is liberating, because she gives no script to follow, no persona to perform for. She invites him to meet her with nothing but presence, truth, and heart. That's the only way in now. Everything else she leaves behind. The negotiations, the performances, the second chances for those. He who wasted the first. The long, drawn-out exits, the over-explained goodbyes. She no longer mourns the ones who can't hold her truth. She simply blesses their path and walks her own. And in that walk, in that unapologetic, radiant, sovereign walk, she becomes more than a woman. She becomes a mirror of the divine feminine itself. To stand in her presence now is to stand before something ancient, something that cannot be controlled, cannot be possessed, and will never again be explained. She has become the ocean, deep, wild, and unknowable to those who only wade at the shore. There are no directions here, no maps, no carefully curated identities to decode. The woman who once bent herself into clarity for the comfort of others now speaks only in energy, in essence, in elemental truth. And this is what makes her truly irresistible, because men are not drawn to logic. They are awakened by mystery, not confusion, but mystery. The difference is profound. Confusion is born of chaos. Mystery is born of depth. She no longer leaves confusion in her wake, but initiation, and only those prepared for the journey will follow. The rest will fall away. Not because she forces them to, but because they cannot breathe in her altitude. Her air is too clean, her rhythm too honest, her frequency too high for those still feeding on distortion, and she does not descend to fetch them. She blesses them from above and continues walking. This is the secret the world never taught her. You don't become powerful by being understood. You become powerful by being whole, whole in your yes, whole in your no, whole in your silence. No explanation required. Carl Jung warned that most people are content to live fragmented lives, unaware of the unconscious forces that shape their relationships, their attractions, their choices. But she is not most people. She has stared into her own abyss. She has touched the dark and pulled herself back. She has healed the part of her that once needed to be liked more than she needed to be honest. And in that healing, she made a vow. Never again would she lower her frequency to be loved. Never again would she explain her sacred instincts to anyone too disconnected to honor them. Never again would she allow guilt to override wisdom. Her path is not paved by apology, it is paved by alignment. So now she walks differently. She speaks only when it's true. She moves only when it's felt. She opens only when it's safe. And she stays only when it's soul. The men who come near her now feel it immediately. This is not a woman to be played with, not because she is hardened, but because she is clear. She will not chase. She will not beg. She will not bend her spirit to keep a man who lacks the courage to rise beside her. She does not seek attention. She is attention. Her silence is not absence. It is invitation. To meet her, you must slow down. To understand her, you must feel. To love her, you must evolve. Because her love is not performative. It is not convenient. It is not soft for the sake of softness. It is fire and water and earth and wind. It is both surrender and strength, and it cannot, will not be explained to someone who has not earned it through depth, presence, and transformation. This is where the game ends, where the patterns break, where the chase loses its power, because she no longer responds to chaos with explanation. She no longer responds to insecurity with performance. She no longer responds to love that comes clothed in fear. She responds only to truth, and when that truth is absent, she becomes silent, and that silence becomes sacred, because it says everything she used to try to explain. It speaks the language of standards, it sings the song of boundaries, it echoes with the sound of a woman who has stopped making herself available to energy that diminishes her. She is no longer here to audition, she is here to choose, and the man who can stand in that fire, who can love her without needing to possess her, who can meet her without needing to tame her, that man will never need an explanation. He will simply feel it. This is not a woman to be understood. This is a woman to be honored. And she will not say a word, because now she doesn't have to. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase. She chooses.